The rain over Boston in the early hours of March 18, 1990, fell not with a sudden fury, but with a persistent, heavy rhythm that seemed to wash the color from the city streets. It was the kind of weather that forces a metropolis to turn inward, creating a blanket of noise that muffles the footsteps of the few who are still awake. And it was under this cover of damp oscillation that the history of art was quietly and irrevocably altered. If you were to walk into the Dutch room tonight, stepping softly across the creaking floorboards of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, you would see them immediately, though it is their absence that commands the eye. There are 4 empty frames, gaping like wounds on the velvet walls, vast rectangles of darkness that interrupt the pattern of the room. They have been waiting there, preserving a void, for over 30 years. Tonight, as we settle into the quiet, we do not just ask who took them or where they might have gone, because those answers have evaporated into the ether. Instead, we ask a question that lingers in the stagnant air of the gallery. What happens during 81 minutes of silence that costs $500 million? We are here to reconstruct that time, not by rushing through the events, but by slowing them down until we can see the particles of dust settling in the wake of the disappearance. In the hours that follow, we will not be engaging in a frantic pursuit of suspects, nor will we be distracted by the loud noises of alarm or panic, for there were none that night. We are looking for the ghosts in the data, the subtle shifts in the atmosphere that signal a change from security to vulnerability. Our journey is one of observation, examining the shadow left behind by the event rather than the event itself. We are searching for the echo, the remnant of a decision made in the dark, and the trace evidence of a plan that relied less on force and more on the exploitation of trust. We are navigating a timeline that is fractured, piecing together a narrative from the silence that fills the space where a Vermeer once hung. It is in this void that the truth often resides, dormant and patient, waiting for someone to look past the obvious and into the obscure. This investigation requires a different kind of focus, one that appreciates the patina of age and the heavy resonance of a building that was designed to be a fortress for beauty. To understand the 81 minutes that emptied those frames, we must first understand the container that held them, the labyrinth of rooms and corridors that Isabella Stewart Gardner constructed to house her obsession. Have you ever entered a room that felt like it was holding its breath, preserving the past in a layer of dust? That is the sensation of Fenway Court. It is a structure that feels less like a museum and more like a memory solidified in stone and plaster, a place where the air itself seems to have a weight and a texture. When Isabella built this palace, she turned it inward, turning its back on the modernizing streets of Boston to face a central courtyard that exists in a perpetual, manufactured spring. The exterior is deceptive, a plain box that gives no hint of the Venetian splendor hidden within. But once you cross the threshold, the world shifts. The courtyard is the heart of the organism, a space where the scent of damp earth and blooming nasturtiums rises to meet the balconies above, creating an atmosphere that is both intoxicating and disorienting. It is a space of obsidian shadows and filtering light, where Roman sarcophagi rest alongside medieval columns, each piece placed with a deliberate, almost ritualistic intent. This was not merely a collection, it was a composition, a carefully curated reality where every painting, every chair, and every scrap of fabric was pinned in place by Isabella's will. She stipulated in her will that nothing should ever be moved. that the arrangement must remain frozen in time. And so the museum became a capsule, drifting through the 20th century while remaining anchored in the 19th. This insistence on permanence creates a strange tension, a feeling that the building is watching you as closely as you are watching it. The dust motes, dancing in the shafts of moonlight that pierce the skylights, are the same dust motes that have cycled through this air for decades, witnesses to the slow decay of silk and the darkening of varnish. As we move mentally through these corridors, we must adopt the pace of the building itself, which is slow, deliberate, and utterly unconcerned with the urgency of the outside world. The walls here are thick, insulating the interior from the vibrations of the city, creating a hollow where sound does not travel far, but instead falls flat, absorbed by the tapestries and the heavy drapes. It is a place of shadows and corners, where a person could stand perfectly still and become part of the architecture, unnoticed by a casual glance. The Dutch Room, located on the second floor, is perhaps the most atmospheric of them all, a space of dark wood and rich fabrics, where the lighting was kept intentionally low to protect the masterpieces. It was here that the silence was deepest, and it was here that the most valuable objects resided, hanging in their gilded frames, confident in their safety. The room feels heavy, laden with the legacy of the old masters, their works acting as windows into other times and other lives, now staring out into the darkened gallery. We must understand that for 81 minutes, this sanctity was violated, not with a crash, but with a quiet dismantling. The thieves who entered did not bring the chaos of the modern world with them. Rather, they slipped into the museum's own rhythm, moving through the labyrinth with a calmness that is almost unsettling to contemplate. They became part of the house's dormancy, utilizing the very quiet that was meant to enhance the art to facilitate its removal. Imagine the sound of footsteps on the tiled floors of the lower cloisters, echoing slightly, but not enough to disturb the stillness of the upper levels. There is a specific resonance to an empty museum at night, a frequency that borders on the hypnotic, where the only accompaniment is the mechanical hum of the heating system and the settling of the foundation. It is in this acoustic environment that the timeline unfolds, a sequence of events measured not in heartbeats, but in the slow sweep of the grandfather clock's pendulum.
The narrative we are weaving tonight is one of fragments, piecing together the sensory details of that night. The smell of rain on wool coats, the tactile sensation of a blade slicing through canvas, the visual of a flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. These are the elements that ground us in the reality of the loss, moving us away from the sensationalism of a heist movie and into the somber reality of forensic history. We are observing the dissolution of a collection, the systematic subtraction of beauty from a place that was built to enshrine it. As we linger in this introduction to the palace, let yourself feel the weight of the history contained within these walls. Think of the hands that carved the frames, the brushes that applied the paint, and the singular woman who brought it all together across an ocean. It is a complex ecosystem of art and architecture, a fragile balance that held for nearly a century before it was disrupted. The emptiness of those frames is not just a lack of canvas, it is a break in the continuity, a pause in the conversation between the artist and the viewer that has lasted for hundreds of years. And so, we stand at the threshold of the timeline, ready to step into the invisible gap that opened up on that rainy night in March. We do so with a sense of reverence for what was lost, and a curiosity about the mechanism of the loss. We are not looking for the adrenaline of the escape, but for the quiet methodology of the removal, the way in which the impossible became inevitable within the span of a single night watch. The clock is ticking, the rain is falling, and the museum is waiting, holding its breath in the darkness, prepared to reveal the anatomy of its own violation. To fully grasp the isolation of the event, we must first anchor ourselves in the specific texture of the night itself, drifting back to the early morning hours of the 18th of March, 1990. Boston is a city that wears its history on its sleeve, but on this particular night, the atmosphere was thick with a chaotic energy that stood in stark contrast to the stillness we are observing inside the museum. It was the tail end of St. Patrick's Day, a holiday that, in this city, is less of a celebration and more of a civic occupation, where the streets of South Boston and the surrounding neighborhoods are filled with the discordant sounds of revelry. Imagine the city as a living organism that is slowly winding down, its streets slick with rain and littered with the debris of a parade that had ended hours ago, while the street lamps reflected in puddles created a fractured mirror of the urban landscape. The air outside was raw and biting, carrying the distinct, metallic chill of a New England coastal spring, where the dampness seems to seep through the walls and into the bone. While the rest of the city was either loud with the remnants of parties or asleep in a drunken stupor, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum stood apart, a dormant fortress of brick and glass that had turned its back on the noise. Inside, the environment was entirely different, possessing a microclimate that felt hermetically sealed against the 20th century. If you were to stand in the foyer that night, the silence would not merely be the absence of sound, but a heavy, physical presence, pressing against your ears with the weight of a library after hours. The air within the museum has always held a specific olfactory signature, a complex bouquet of old floor wax, the sweet, cloying scent of lilies and damp earth rising from the courtyard, and the faint, dry odor of ancient paper and stone. It is a smell that suggests preservation, a scent that belongs to things that have not moved in a very long time. The temperature, too, was distinct. While the heating system hummed its low, mechanical lullaby, the vast, open spaces of the galleries often held pockets of chilly, drafty air, remnants of the winter that had not yet fully released its grip. Have you ever stood in a large, empty house at night and felt the architecture itself settling around you? That is the feeling here, a sense that the building is a hollow vessel, resonating with the vibrations of the passing traffic outside, but remaining untouched by it. The contrast is absolute. Outside, the oscillation of sirens and shouting. Inside, the rhythmic dripping of rain on the glass roof and the slow, steady ticking of time. This separation is crucial because it creates a psychological moat around the art, a barrier that usually protects the collection but, on this night, served to isolate the guards from the world. We must now turn our attention to the vessel itself, to the architecture of shadows that defines the experience of moving through Fenway Court. It is not merely a building. It is a labyrinth designed to disorient and enchant, a structure where the layout is dictated not by logic, but by the whims of a collector who viewed her home as a stage set for her own immortality. As we mentally walk through the blueprints, tracing the path from the entrance to the galleries, we begin to understand the sheer scale of the space and the complexity of the shadows that inhabit it. The heart of the museum is the courtyard, a stunning, covered atrium that brings the outdoors in, yet keeps it suspended in a perpetual state of perfection. On that night, the courtyard was a cavern of filtered moonlight and electric gloom, filled with the shapes of plants and statues that appeared almost human in the dim light. To understand the sensory overload that disguises the quiet movements of an intruder, consider the botanical inventory that filled the air with its perfume. The Gardner is famous for its rotating displays, and in the transition of seasons, the courtyard is a riot of cultivated nature. Picture the specific flora that might have been breathing in the darkness. The tall, vibrant stems of cineraria, with their clusters of purple and blue. The waxy, structural leaves of clivia. The delicate, fern-like foliage of jasmine waiting to bloom, and the heavy, earthen pots holding ferns that have outlived their caretakers. It is a list that implies life, yet in the context of the theft, these plants were merely silent witnesses, absorbing the sound of footsteps on the tiled perimeter. We move from the organic to the textual, ascending the stairs to the rooms where the treasures hung, noting the specific materials that line the walls. For Isabella did not believe in white paint. The walls themselves are part of the art, clad in fabrics that absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an environment of deep, velvety obscurity. There is the crimson damask of the Dutch room, a fabric so rich and heavy that it seems to swallow the dim light, providing a blood-red backdrop for the Rembrandts and the Vermeers. There is the cool, pale blue of the silk in the Veronese room, leather hangings stamped with gold, and heavy tapestries from Brussels and fading velvets that have worn down to the thread in places, acquiring a patina of age that speaks to the passage of a century. These materials dampen sound, ensuring that a footfall on the hardwood floor does not echo sharply, but rather thuds softly, a sound that is easily lost in the vastness of the space. The layout requires one to weave through these rooms in a specific sequence, a journey that feels less like walking through a museum and more like exploring a private, forgotten mansion. The Raphael room, the short gallery, the Gothic room each, is a distinct chapter in a visual novel, connected by narrow corridors and heavy doors that, on this night, were barriers that failed. The thieves moved through this textile landscape, passing the dormant eyes of portraits and the cold surfaces of marble busts, navigating a space that was designed to be intimate, but which, in the absence of crowds, became desolate. To visualize this is to understand the vulnerability of the collection. It was hidden in plain sight, protected by walls of brick and layers of silk, but unguarded against the audacity of a simple deception. The architecture, with all its beauty and its shadows, became a trap, a gilded cage where the birds were asleep, unaware that the door was about to be opened. In the deep architecture of security, we often focus on the thickness of the walls, the complexity of the locks, and the sensitivity of the alarms, forgetting that the final failsafe is almost always human, and humans are creatures of habit, fatigue, and profound underestimation. If the museum was a labyrinth of shadows and dormant beauty, the men charged with navigating it were not the hardened sentinels one might expect to find guarding a collection worth $500 million. They were, instead, merely the quiet occupants of a desk, two young men suspended in the amber of a slow, rainy night shift where the enemy was not a master thief, but the crushing weight of boredom. At the center of this human equation was Rick Abath, a 23-year-old aspiring musician with a drift to his spirit that seemed to match the bohemian history of the museum itself. He was a dropout from the Berklee College of Music, a man who played in a band and wore his hair long, embodying a counterculture aesthetic that felt at home in the arts, if not in the rigid discipline of security protocols. Alongside him was Randy Hestand, 25 years old and relatively new to the rotation, a figure who was there simply to fill the hours and earn a paycheck, viewing the museum less as a sacred trust and more as a quiet place to endure until morning. They were not soldiers, they were students of the mundane, paid a wage that barely hovered above the minimum, tasked with protecting priceless remnants of the Italian Renaissance, with little more than a flashlight and a two-way radio. Have you ever worked a job where the primary challenge was simply staying awake while the rest of the world slept? It is a specific kind of psychological state, a hollow drift where time seems to lose its elasticity, stretching out in long, thinning strands. For Abath and Histand, the night of March 18th was not charged with premonition. It was heavy with routine. They sat at the security desk, a small island of fluorescent light in a sea of darkness, surrounded by the hum of monitors that cycled through gray, grainy views of empty rooms. The desk itself was a testament to the unglamorous reality of the job, cluttered with the detritus of a long shift. A logbook with dog-eared pages, a thermos of coffee that had likely turned bitter hours ago, and the personal effects that people bring to anchor themselves in a workspace that isn't truly theirs. The ritual of their night was defined by the oscillation between sitting and walking, a pattern as predictable as the pendulum of a clock. One guard would remain at the desk, watching the screens where nothing ever moved, while the other would take the patrol, walking the perimeter of the galleries, listening to the creak of the floorboards and the settling of the building's foundation. It was a cycle of checking watches, not to mark the arrival of a threat, but to calculate how many hours remained until sunrise, counting down the minutes until they could hand over the keys and step back into the noise of the city. In this vacuum of activity, the senses become dull rather than sharp, lulled into complacency by the sheer repetition of the nothingness. The logbook, which should have been a record of vigilance, became a ledger of the trivial, marking the rounds with a quick scribble of a pen, a bureaucratic necessity that felt increasingly abstract as the night wore on. There was no sense of impending loss, only the low, constant hum of the heater fighting the damp chill of the entry hall, and the feeling that the museum was a static entity, a massive, stone object that would simply exist forever, regardless of who was watching it. They were young men in a very old house, and their lack of training was not a failure of character, but a systemic oversight, a belief that the building's reputation alone was enough to repel the outside world. They did not know that they were sitting on the edge of history. They only knew that it was late, that the rain was falling harder against the glass, and that the silence of the museum felt absolute, a protective ether that they believed would last until the morning shift arrived. The timeline of any great loss is often punctuated by a single, mechanical sound that divides the before from the after. And at the Gardner Museum, that sound was not an explosion or a shout, but the sharp, electric buzz of an intercom at 1:24 a.m. It was a noise that cut through the silence of the security desk, pulling Rick Abath from the rhythm of his boredom and demanding an immediate, reflexive response. To understand why the door was opened, we must step away from the advantage of hindsight and inhabit the psychology of that specific moment, a moment where fatigue meets the sudden imposition of authority. The system was designed as a filter, a way to keep the city out while the museum slept, but every filter relies on the judgment of the person operating it. When Abath looked at the monitor, he saw what appeared to be the grainy, black and white silhouette of order. A police car parked on Palace Road, and two figures standing in the shadows of the side entrance. The voice that came through the intercom was not aggressive, but calm and declarative, stating simply, "Police. We heard noise. We're coming in." It is a statement that bypasses the logical centers of the brain and speaks directly to our social conditioning. When authority speaks in a quiet voice, do we instinctively obey, or do we question the shadow standing in the doorway? For a 23-year-old night watchman, The uniform is a symbol that overrides protocol. The expectation is that the police are the protectors of the perimeter, not the threat against it. In that fraction of a second, the decision was made not out of negligence, but out of compliance. Abath pressed the button, and the magnetic lock disengaged with a heavy, metallic clack, a sound that signaled the breach of the fortress. The door swung open, and the two men stepped out of the rain and into the warmth of the museum's employee entrance. As they entered, the reality of their disguise began to assert itself, though in the dim light of the hallway, the details were designed to pass a cursory inspection rather than a forensic one. They were dressed in the visual shorthand of law enforcement, wearing uniforms that projected legitimacy through their silhouette rather than their specificity. They wore dark coats with silver badges pinned to the chest, catching the flicker of the fluorescent lights. But a closer look, one that Abath did not have the time or the suspicion to take, would have revealed the cracks in the facade. The uniforms were a collage of legitimacy, a patchwork of generic authority. The hats were not the standard issue of the Boston Police Department, but rather a generic style that one might find in a costume shop or a surplus store. The badges, while shiny, lacked the specific departmental engravings that a seasoned officer would recognize. Most tellingly, the men did not carry the heavy, visible weaponry that is the hallmark of an on-duty patrolman. Their belts were lighter, lacking the clutter of radios, handcuffs, and batons that usually weigh down a police officer's hips. Yet, in the vacuum of the night shift, these discrepancies were lost in the immediate presence of the men themselves. One was taller, taking the lead with a demeanor that was practiced and steady, while the other hung back, a silent partner in the deception. Their motion was not hurried. There was no rush to secure the area, no sweeping of the room with flashlights. Instead, they moved with a casual confidence, walking directly to the security desk as if they had an appointment, their footsteps heavy and deliberate on the linoleum floor. This was the trap in its purest form, a manipulation of social norms rather than a physical assault. The taller man looked at Abath, his face obscured by the brim of his hat and the shadows of the room, and issued a command that felt like a procedure rather than a threat. He asked for identification, shifting the dynamic so that the guard, the person who should have been in control, was suddenly the one under scrutiny. "You look familiar," the intruder said, a phrase designed to disarm and confuse, to make Abath question his own memory rather than the stranger's intent. "I think we have a warrant for you." It was a piece of theater, a script written to keep the adrenaline low and the compliance high. By framing the interaction as a legal matter involving the guard personally, the thieves ensured that Abath's focus turned inward, worrying about his own status rather than the security of the collection. He stepped away from the desk, away from the panic button, and walked into the open space where the trap could be sprung. It was a moment of profound psychological manipulation, where the very instinct to cooperate became the mechanism of the crime. Randy Hestand, returning from his patrol, walked into this scene of quiet coercion, finding his partner already submitting to the authority of the intruders. There was no struggle, no shouting, only the surreal calmness of a procedure unfolding in the wrong place at the wrong time. The thieves told the guards to step away from the desk, to face the wall, and to place their hands on their heads. It was the standard choreography of an arrest, performed in the employee airlock of a museum, and for a few critical minutes, the illusion held. The transition from police officers to intruders happened not with a weapon drawn, but with a simple, chilling realization. As Abath stood facing the wall, the cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and he remarked that the cuffs were too tight. The reply from the man behind him was the first crack in the mask, a drop in the register of the voice that signaled the end of the play. "That's not why you're here," the voice said, or perhaps simply, "Don't worry, you won't be in them long." The pretense of the warrant evaporated, leaving only the raw, unspoken fact that the museum was now under the control of strangers. The breach was complete. The perimeter had not been stormed. It had been invited in. The doors were closed again, sealing the thieves and the guards inside the same box. The buzzer had done its work. The uniforms had served their purpose, and now the 81-minute clock began to tick in earnest. The security desk, once the hub of observation, was now abandoned, its monitors flickering with the empty views of the galleries above, recording nothing but the silence of the rooms waiting to be emptied. The transition from authority to captivity was not marked by a sudden escalation of force, but rather by a methodical, almost bureaucratic efficiency that served to deepen the confusion of the two young guards. Once the handcuffs were applied, the dynamic in the small security vestibule shifted entirely. The pretense of a police investigation dissolved into the cold reality of a containment, yet the atmosphere remained strangely quiet, devoid of the shouting or aggression one might expect during a hostile takeover.
We often imagine these moments as frantic struggles for survival. But in the hollow silence of the museum, the neutralization of Rick Abath and Randy Hestand was a slow, deliberate process, a dismantling of their agency that felt less like a crime and more like a procedure. The intruders, now clearly revealed as the architects of the night's events, did not strike the guards, nor did they brandish weapons in a way that invited panic. Instead, they issued instructions with a flat, unemotional resonance that made obedience seem like the only logical option. The takedown was a sequence of movements designed to reduce the human variables in the equation to zero. Hestand, the newer guard, was the first to be fully processed, his compliance secured by the sheer absurdity of the situation. He was turned away from the light, his face pressed against the cool, painted plaster of the wall, while the taller of the two men began the work of securing him for the duration of the night. It was here that the tools of the trade shifted from the metallic click of handcuffs to the tearing sound of adhesive, a noise that is distinct and jagged in a quiet room. The tape they used was not the heavy, industrial-grade material one might find on a construction site, reinforced with fibers and impossible to break. It was standard, gray duct tape, the kind found in any household drawer, utilitarian and mundane. Yet, in this context, it became a tool of total sensory deprivation. It was wrapped systematically around Hestand's eyes, a cold, sticky blindfold that instantly cut off his visual connection to the world, plunging him into an internal darkness that was far more disorienting than the dim light of the hallway. Consider the sensation of that application. The chemical smell of the adhesive, the smooth, plastic texture against the skin, and the feeling of the tape tightening as it was wound around the wrists and ankles. It was a binding that was meant to immobilize, not to injure, turning a living witness into a dormant object that could be moved and placed like a piece of furniture. Abath, watching this unfold from the periphery of his own fear, was subjected to the same treatment, his long hair likely catching in the adhesive as the tape was wound around his head, leaving only a small opening for his nose and mouth. They were told to remain calm, a directive that floated in the ether of the room, reinforcing the strange, controlled nature of the event. The thieves were not rushing. They were taking the time to ensure that the containment was absolute, treating the guards with a detached professionalism that suggested they had done this before, or at least had rehearsed it in their minds 1,000 times. As the guards were bound, a critical question lingers in the air, hovering over the security desk that stood just a few feet away. Why was the alarm never raised? There was a panic button, a small, unobtrusive switch located beneath the desk, designed to send a silent signal to the police, a lifeline that could have summoned help within minutes. But the psychology of the panic button is complex. It requires a moment of clarity, a split-second decision to escalate the situation, and on this night, that moment was stolen by the intruder's deception. By the time Abbott realized that the men were not police officers, he had already stepped away from the desk, lured into the open by the request for identification, leaving the button just out of reach, a fragment of safety that was now impossibly distant. The desk itself, with its monitors and its logbook, sat empty, a silent witness to the failure of the system. The button remained unpressed, a dormant circuit that would never be closed. It is a haunting detail, a reminder of how fragile our security systems are when they rely on human perception. The technology worked perfectly, but the mind operating it had been hacked by a simple costume and a confident voice. Once the guards were blinded and bound, they were no longer the guardians of the museum. They were cargo. The intruders moved them, not roughly, but firmly, guiding them through the corridors they had patrolled just minutes earlier. They were led down into the basement, a part of the museum that feels miles away from the velvet-lined galleries above. The air down there is different, stagnant, smelling of old stone and the damp earth of the foundation. And it was there, in the deep recesses of the building, that the guards were separated. Abbott was secured to a workbench, his body taped to the heavy wooden structure, while Hestand was led further away, placed in a separate storage area. They were left in the dark, isolated from one another, forced to listen to the sounds of the museum settling above them. The footsteps of the thieves receded, moving up the stairs, leaving the basement in a profound, obsidian silence. The containment was complete. The eyes of the museum had been closed, the ears covered, and the only people left moving in the building were the ones who had come to empty it. In the absence of human eyes, the burden of memory fell to a machine, a primitive digital observer that sat quietly in the basement, logging the invisible shifts of the atmosphere above. While the guards lay bound in the darkness of the cellar, the museum's security mainframe continued its work, indifferent to the violation taking place, dutifully recording the presence of the intruders not as people, but as data points on a timeline. This record, a continuous, perforated scroll of dot matrix paper, remains the most objective witness to the 81 minutes of silence, a forensic artifact that allows us to trace the anatomy of the theft with a precision that human memory could never achieve. To understand the weight of this evidence, we must first appreciate the technology of the era, which functioned very differently from the sleek, laser-guided systems we rely on today. The motion detectors installed in the Gardner Museum in 1990 were passive infrared sensors, or PIRs, devices that did not actively sweep the room with beams of light, but rather waited, dormant and receptive, for a change in the thermal landscape. They were looking for heat, for the specific infrared radiation emitted by a human body moving through a space that should have been the same temperature as the surrounding air. These sensors were the nerve endings of the building, designed to detect the oscillation of temperature that occurs when a warm object passes across a cold background, a mechanism that is both elegant and prone to its own unique form of blindness. In 1990, these devices lacked the sophistication to distinguish between a thief and a draft, or to track a target that moved with sufficient slowness to blend into the ambient thermal noise of the room. This technological limitation is crucial, for it suggests that the thieves, whether by training or by accident, moved at a pace that occasionally rendered them invisible, slipping into the ether between the sensor's refresh cycles. Let us look now at the hard evidence, the physical manifestation of the timeline that unspooled from the printer with a rhythmic, mechanical scratching. Imagine the sound of that printer in the empty security office, the printhead sliding back and forth, depositing ink on the page line by line, documenting the crime in real time while no one was there to read it. The paper itself has a texture we have largely forgotten, the alternating green and white bars, the perforated edges that allow the sheets to be torn away, a tangible remnant of a bureaucratic past. We begin the reading of the timestamps, not as a list of numbers, but as a map of movement through the labyrinth. At 1:24 a.m., the printer logged the first anomaly, a breach at the employee entrance. This was the moment the buzzer sounded, the moment the seal was broken. For the next several minutes, the data is chaotic, reflecting the movement of the guards and the intruders in the foyer, a cluster of signals that resolves into a chilling stillness once the containment was complete. Then, the data trail begins to climb the stairs. At 1:48 a.m., the sensors in the Dutch room, the heart of the museum's collection, triggered for the first time. This timestamp is the beginning of the end for the masterpieces. It tells us that 24 minutes elapsed between the entry and the arrival at the target, a period of time that feels incredibly long for a heist, suggesting a lack of urgency that is almost unnerving. They were not sprinting, they were walking, perhaps even pausing to admire the architecture, secure in their control of the environment. At 1:49 a.m., the signal repeats in the Dutch room. They are moving in front of the Rembrandts. At 1:51 a.m., the motion continues. We can visualize the heat signatures of the men standing before the storm on the Sea of Galilee, their body heat radiating against the cold varnish of the painting. But then we encounter the silence. Between 1:51 a.m. and 2:03 a.m., the sensors in the Dutch room went dark. For 12 minutes, the room appeared empty to the machine, yet we know, based on the physical evidence of the empty frames, that the thieves were still there, working. This is the first ghost in the machine, a period of activity so still, so methodical, that it failed to trigger the infrared thresholds. Were they standing perfectly still, contemplating the canvas? Or were they moving with such deliberate, fluid slowness, cutting the canvas from the stretchers with a razor blade that the sensors perceived them as part of the furniture? At 2:03 a.m., the pattern shifts. The sensors pick up movement in the short gallery. This indicates a migration, a decision to leave the Dutch room and move toward the next target. The trail leads them to the blue room, where the sensors register activity at 2:05 a.m. Here, the timeline becomes a series of fragments, brief illuminations of location that tell us where they were, but not exactly what they were doing. The paper unspools further, recording a return to the Dutch room at 2:08 a.m., a checking of the work, perhaps, or the retrieval of a forgotten tool. The oscillation between the rooms suggests a systematic sweeping of the second floor, a comfortable navigation of the space that implies they had studied the blueprints, or, at the very least, were following a mental map that had been drawn long before they entered the building. And then there is the final anomaly, the data point that has puzzled investigators for decades. The printout shows that the thieves exited the museum at 2:45 a.m., the side door opening and closing one last time, sealing the building back into its tomb-like state. However, if one looks closely at the logs from the motion detectors in the hours that followed, there are faint, isolated signals, fleeting registrations of movement in the galleries that should have been empty. Were these merely the settling of the building, the shifting of air currents as the heating system cycled on and off? Or was there a lingering presence, a delay in the atmosphere returning to equilibrium? Some have suggested that these phantom signals are merely electronic noise, the result of an aging system interpreting the dust motes dancing in the moonlight as solid matter. Others find a more unsettling resonance in these timestamps, a suggestion that perhaps the building itself was reacting to the loss, the sensors firing in response to the sudden void where the paintings used to be. We are left with a document that is both exhaustive and incomplete, a linear record of a non-linear event. The motion detector printout tells us when they were there, but it keeps the secret of how they moved so quietly that they could disappear from the electronic eye while standing in the center of the room. It is a timeline of hollow spaces, a digital narrative that ends not with a capture, but with a return to the dormant, steady rhythm of a machine monitoring a vacuum. When we consider the act of theft, we often imagine a seamless transfer of possession, where an object moves from one hand to another remains intact, its value preserved by the delicacy of the touch. However, the events in the Dutch room were not merely a theft. They were a surgical extraction, a sequence of physical alterations that forever changed the material reality of the masterpieces involved. As the thieves stood before the walls, surrounded by the heavy, watching eyes of the portraits, they were faced with a decision that has baffled investigators and art historians for decades: the selection itself. Why these specific paintings? The logic of the heist appears fractured when viewed through the lens of pure market value, for the thieves moved past the most valuable painting in the collection, Titian's The Rape of Europa, leaving it hanging untouched in its gilded frame. This canvas, a swirling masterpiece of Renaissance color and light, was arguably worth more than the entire hall combined. Yet it was ignored, a dormant treasure bypassed in favor of other, sometimes lesser, works. Was this an act of ignorance, a list dictated by a specific buyer with eclectic tastes, or simply the result of an opportunity seized in the dim light? They chose Rembrandt's only seascape, the storm on the Sea of Galilee, a painting of tumultuous energy and obsidian waves, and The Concert by Vermeer, a quiet, intimate interior scene that is now the most valuable missing object in the world. They also took a bronze finial in the shape of a Napoleonic eagle, a piece of relatively low value compared to the canvases, suggesting a chaotic oscillation between calculated acquisition and the attraction to simple, shiny objects. Once the targets were chosen, the methodology shifted from observation to intervention, and this is where the timeline becomes a visceral experience of destruction. The paintings were not simply lifted from the wall, they were harvested. The frames that Isabella Stewart Gardner had chosen were heavy, anchored to the structure of the room, and rather than wrestling with the carpentry, the thieves chose a more direct, irreversible path. Imagine the sound of a sharp blade meeting 300-year-old linen. It is a specific, dry sound, like the tearing of a withered leaf, a noise that would have seemed deafening in the hollow silence of the gallery. The canvas, stretched tight for centuries, would have released its tension with a soft snap as the knife cut along the perimeter, separating the image from its support. This was not the work of art handlers trained to preserve the patina of the ages. It was the rough, utilitarian work of men who viewed the masterpieces not as windows into the soul, but as currency to be rolled up and transported. As the blade moved through the layers of oil, paint, and varnish, it created a microscopic debris field, a rain of fine particles that drifted down to the floor. The varnish, hardened by time into a brittle shell, would have crumbled under the pressure, creating a jagged edge where the image was severed. We must pause to consider the texture of this violence, the friction of steel against antique fabric, the breaking of the chemical bonds that held the pigments together. It was a violation of the integrity of the object, a brutality inflicted upon beauty that left physical scars which, even if the paintings are returned, will never fully heal. The forensic evidence left behind tells a story of haste and disregard. On the floor of the Dutch room, investigators later found tiny fragments of paint and gold leaf, the crumbs of a feast that had been consumed in the dark. These specks of color, remnants of a stormy sea or a velvet coat, were the only physical traces of the art that remained, scattered like dust on the Persian rug. The frames themselves were left hanging, empty rectangles of darkness that now framed nothing but the velvet wall behind them, gaping like wounds that had been cauterized by the cool night air. This process, repeated for each canvas, transformed the room from a gallery into a crime scene. But it also transformed the art itself. A rolled painting is a compromised object. The paint cracks, the structure weakens, and the image is hidden from view, existing only in the memory of the ether. The thieves were not just taking the objects. They were extinguishing their light, rolling them into tight cylinders that suffocated the composition. As we visualize the empty frames, which still hang in the museum today as a vigil for the missing, we are forced to confront a question that touches the very nature of preservation. Is the value of art found in the paint and the canvas, or does it reside in the memory of those who once gazed upon it? Does the painting cease to exist because we can no longer see it, or does it become something else, a legend, a ghost, a story that grows more powerful with every year of its absence? The physical extraction was a crude, mechanical act, taking 81 minutes to dismantle what had taken centuries to revere. But the resonance of that act continues to vibrate through the art world. The frames remain, waiting for a return that may never happen, holding the space for a beauty that was cut away in the dark, leaving behind only the silence of the void and the lingering question of where. At 2:45 a.m., the magnetic lock on the side door engaged for the final time that night. A soft, mechanical click that signaled the end of the intrusion and the beginning of the long, hollow silence that has lasted for decades. The thieves did not speed away with the screech of tires or the wail of sirens. They simply dissolved back into the obsidian dampness of the Boston night, their vehicle merging with the few remaining cars on the road, carrying a cargo of canvas and bronze that had been stripped of its context. Inside the museum, the atmosphere slowly began to settle, the air currents returning to their natural drift, though the chemistry of the space had been fundamentally altered. The guards remained in the basement, bound and blindfolded in the dark, measuring the passage of time by the ache in their limbs and the rhythmic settling of the house above them. It was not until the morning shift arrived, bringing with it the gray light of a rainy dawn, that the true scope of the vacancy was discovered. As the police tape was strung across the entrance, fluttering in the cold wind coming off the fens, the museum transformed from a private sanctuary into a public crime scene, a transition that felt jarring against the patina of the building's history. The investigation that followed was exhaustive, a sprawling effort that extended from the narrow streets of Boston's North End to the antique markets of Europe and the hidden warehouses of Japan. yet it seemed to move through a medium of profound resistance. The Federal Bureau of Investigation found themselves navigating a labyrinth of shadows, where solid leads would suddenly evaporate into the ether, leaving behind only frustration and conjecture. There were no fingerprints that offered a match, no DNA that could be pulled from the debris of the night, only the fragments of a story that refused to cohere. Theories began to drift through the case like smoke, vague and dreamlike narratives that sought to explain the impossible. There were whispers of the Boston Mafia, of old men in social clubs trading the Rembrandts as leverage for leniency, treating the masterpieces like poker chips in a high-stakes game of negotiation. There were rumors of the Irish Republican Army, suggesting the art had crossed the ocean to fund a conflict in a different world, hidden in the false bottoms of crates or buried in the damp earth of a farm. Yet, these theories remain dormant, possibilities that lack the friction of hard evidence to make them real. We are left not with the captors, but with the void they created. The investigation has become a study in negative space, defined not by what was found, but by what is missing. The art has not surfaced, it has not appeared on the black market, nor has it been recovered in a sting operation. It simply ceased to be part of the visible world, existing now only in the resonance of the empty frames that still hang in the Dutch room. These frames are the most haunting aspect of the aftermath. A decision made by the museum to honor Isabella Stewart Gardner's will that nothing be moved. They remain on the walls, vast rectangular outlines that frame the blank floral patterns of the damask, waiting for the return of the images that once filled them. They are a monument to the 81 minutes we have just witnessed, a physical placeholder for a memory that is slowly fading from the collective consciousness. As we stand before them in our mind's eye, the questions lose their urgency and take on a more meditative quality. Where are they now? Are they rolled up in a tube in a dusty attic, their varnish darkening in the heat? Are they buried beneath a floorboard, protected by layers of plastic and secrecy? Or have they, like the night itself, become part of the past, accessible only through the stories we tell in the dark? The storm on the Sea of Galilee has been stilled, the concert has ended, and the lady and gentleman in black have left the room. What remains is the building, the rain, and the quiet, persistent hope that one day the door will open again, and the silence will be broken not by a theft, but by a return. As the years have turned into decades, the investigation into the Gardner heist has transformed from a hot pursuit into a dormant, lingering question that hangs over the art world like a low fog. Yet, amidst the silence and the dead ends, there exists a tangible, vibrant tether to the stolen works, a promise of redemption that is as staggering as the loss itself. It is a number that seems almost abstract in its magnitude: $10 million. This is the reward that currently stands, fully funded and waiting, for information that leads directly to the recovery of the 13 works. It is the largest private reward ever offered for stolen property, a pot of gold sitting at the end of a very dark, very long rainbow. It sits there, unclaimed, a financial beacon beaming out into the criminal underworld and the quiet corners of the globe, asking for a simple exchange: the truth for a fortune. Think about the psychological weight of that sum. It is enough to change a life, enough to rewrite a history, yet it has not been enough to break the code of silence that surrounds these objects. It suggests that the fear of consequence, or perhaps the loyalty to the secret, is stronger than the allure of wealth. Or perhaps it suggests that the knowledge has been lost, buried with the men who carried it, leaving the reward to gather dust alongside the files in the FBI's archives. It is a strange, suspended state of affairs, where a fortune waits for a phone call that never comes. We return now, in our mind's eye, to the museum as it stands today. If you were to visit the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum this afternoon, you would find it much as it was in 1990. The nasturtiums still cascade from the balconies of the courtyard. The light still filters through the glass roof to play on the Roman mosaics, and the air still holds that peculiar, timeless scent of wax and stone. But when you ascend the stairs and enter the Dutch room, the continuity breaks. You are met with the empty frames. They are not hidden away, they are not replaced by other works or covered by heavy drapes. They hang exactly where Rembrandt and Vermeer once placed their subjects, marking the precise dimensions of the absence. This unique, haunting arrangement is dictated by the ironclad will of Isabella Stewart Gardner herself, a document that stated with absolute clarity that the arrangement of the museum must never be altered. "Nothing can be moved," she wrote, binding the future curators to her vision. And so, the empty frames must stay. In adhering to this rule, the museum has inadvertently created a new kind of masterpiece, a monument to loss that is perhaps more powerful than the paintings themselves. The frames have become a presence in their own right, vast rectangles of negative space that force the viewer to confront the void. When you look at them, you do not just see a lack of canvas. You see the violence of the removal, the jagged interruption of history. It is a conceptual art piece born of tragedy, a permanent reminder that beauty is fragile and can be taken in an instant. Consider the analogy of a symphony. Imagine sitting in a grand concert hall, listening to a complex, beautiful piece of music that has been playing for centuries. The orchestra is full, the sound is rich and enveloping, carrying you along on a wave of emotion. And then, suddenly, the violins stop. The conductor continues to move his baton. The other instruments continue their harmonies. But the melody, the heart of the piece, is gone. The empty frames are that silence. The music of the museum has not stopped. The building still stands. The other collections remain. But there is a gap in the sonic landscape, a pause that stretches on and on. The audience is still listening, straining their ears to hear the notes that should be there, filling in the blanks with their memory and their imagination. It is a silence that is heavy with resonance, a quiet that speaks louder than the noise of the city outside. We stand now at the end of our timeline, looking back at the 81 minutes that changed everything. We have walked the wet pavement of Boston, stood in the shadows of the courtyard, and watched the slow, surgical dismantling of a legacy. The thieves, whoever they were, have vanished into the fog of history, leaving behind only ripples in the data and a story that refuses to end. They are ghosts now, figures made of speculation and rumor, their identities obscured by the very time that they stole. The frames remain, stubborn and stoic, waiting for a return that may never come. They are open eyes, watching the door, holding the space for the storm to rage again and for the concert to resume. But the mystery is yours to keep. It is a puzzle that you can carry with you into the sleep that follows, a labyrinth of what-ifs and might-have-beens that has no exit. As we fade to black, letting the visual world dissolve into the ether, we are left only with the sound of the rain, the same rhythmic drumming that covered the crime on that night in March. It is a cleansing sound, a steady wash of water that smooths over the rough edges of the day. If you have found solace in this investigation and wish to walk these rainy streets with us again, exploring the quiet corners of forensic history where the answers are hidden in the shadows, Please subscribe and share this case with others who seek the quiet. Like the video to help us keep the files open, to ensure that the algorithm does not bury the story like the paintings themselves. And now, let the rain wash away the rest of the day. The timeline is closed, the evidence is filed, the museum is quiet. Good night, sleep well, detective.